much, everyone. Good evening in Asia, good afternoon in Europe. Welcome to this event from the Asian Racing Federation. My name is Martin Pobrick and I chair the ARF Council on Anti-Illegal Betting and Related Financial Crime. And our focus today is a discussion of the latest report from the ARF Council, which is the state of illegal betting. And we have three panelists who will talk through different aspects of the report, but also different aspects of their work, which relate to some of the content of the report. I'll just give a little bit of background for each of them so they don't have to introduce themselves. We have James Porteous, who's research manager at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. James and his team conduct research into global illegal betting markets and grey markets, especially those linked to transnational organised crime and also the negative impact of betting markets on society. Particularly relevant, obviously, because of their proximity to mainland China, which has huge betting markets, most of it illegal. James is a bit of a sports nut, I think it would be fair to say. Has a career as a journalist with the South China Morning Post before the Jockey Club, and before that with the Herald in Glasgow. I should say sports journalist, perhaps, as a speciality. Next, we have Tom Chignell, I think one of the most experienced executives in the racing sector and the sports sector, frankly, in bet monitoring, bet analysis, and integrity related management from that. So Tom is the executive manager of racing integrity and betting analysis at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. Before that, he was with the British Horse Racing Authority. Has over 15 years experience implementing systems and processes relating to detecting suspicious betting across regulated and illegal markets. And I'd stress the latter part. I think if you're going to be involved in racing and sports betting integrity, you do need to understand illegal markets as well as the legal markets. And Tom's work has been used as evidence in multiple sports, not just racing, in betting and corruption cases in the UK police and other government agencies. And finally, last but not least, Brant Dunshea, Chief Regulatory Officer of the British Horse Racing Authority. Brant, I'm not sure if he qualifies as a Brit now, depending on the sporting event, I suspect. But Brant's been in the UK for many years now, has a very long experience, over 25 years experience in racing and sports regulation in both Australia and Britain. So welcome to all three of you, and we'll get started with some comments shortly. If I could just give a bit more background. The ARF Council, for those of you who haven't seen it before, haven't read our reports, which are quite lengthy, was established in 2017. Sort of originated from the Hong Kong Jockey Club, which drove this effort, but it's very much a multinational, multi-agency, multi-organisation council. Currently has 18 members, not only from horse racing, but also sports integrity organisations, law enforcement, international organisations such as Interpol, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and academia. We currently have 6 university professors who are members of the council, which is obviously very important for us as a think tank for their collaboration. The purpose of the council is to enhance international cooperation amongst horse racing and other sports authorities. We cross over sports and we work with regulators and authorities in other sports, betting regulators, intergovernmental organisations and government agencies to better combat the threat of illegal betting and other financial crimes to horse racing and other sports. Obviously, the focus is on illegal betting, but it becomes quite grey on a spectrum of when and how betting is illegal. And we'll talk more about that shortly. So why did we write this report, The State of Illegal Betting? Well, we did feel that we needed to say something about what's the current state of betting markets in relation to integrity and some of the other threats to racing and other sports. And James in particular will go into some of the nuances between legality and illegality in betting, which are becoming increasingly grey, we think. Also, because we've seen far greater betting liquidity injected into racing and other sports during the pandemic, this in itself has posed greater integrity risks, we think. Risk levels go up as betting liquidity goes up, especially into lower levels of competition. In racing and other sports, which aren't as closely monitored, and where participants are lower paid, frankly, one of the key risk areas. So the pandemic, I think, has heightened the risk of integrity in racing and other betting sports. So just some housekeeping for attendees. Could I remind you, we're on Zoom webinar platforms, so you can't be seen or heard, but you can write something. So we'd like to hear your questions put to the panelists or put to anyone. If you could put them in the Zoom Q&A function anytime during the webinar, and then I'll get to them after the three panelists have spoken. So please do put questions. We really want to hear what others want to ask the panelists about racing and other sports and the betting on those areas. So if we could kick off with James. James, obviously going to talk most about the new report, The State of Illegal Betting. Could you tell the attendees what you found from the research into the state of illegal betting now, and how do you think this situation has changed in the last 5 years or so? James, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thanks everybody for joining. I think one of the main things we saw from the research, particularly in section 1 and section 2 of the report, which we'll talk about, it was really kind of confirmation in hard numbers, in data of what we had been seeing, but now we had like hard analytics to put beside it, and that was basically the blurring of the lines between what is legal and what is illegal. The illegal market's outpacing the legal market in terms of growth, and how rapid advancements in technology are fueling these phenomena. So I'll show a couple of slides. Yeah, so Martin's talked about the report. If you haven't read it, it's available at asianracing.org. We believe it's the most comprehensive overview yet of an issue which is still really too little understood by not just racing and other sports, but governments, law enforcement, and other key stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholders throughout this webinar today, we're really talking about anybody who loves sport, which I think is everybody on this call, and anybody who does not love organized crime and the corruption of sport. The report seeks to inform readers and these stakeholders about what illegal betting is, why it's bad, why they should care about it, why this is not, as many continue wrongly to believe, some sort of victimless crime. So in terms of section 1, which was the main section I contributed to, I think Tom will talk a bit more, and Brant, about sections they contributed to. The key findings from section 1, which was a kind of data-driven analysis of more than 500 websites. Essentially, about 2/3 of the websites we looked at were not licensed and regulated. In other words, illegal in most jurisdictions. So the illegal market is about 2/3 of the entire market, and crucially growing faster than the legal market. So simply put, illegal betting is massive, and it's growing bigger and faster, and it remains a key threat, perhaps the key threat, to the integrity of racing and other sports. Yeah, in terms of key changes, Martin, from 5 years ago, we have to look at technology. Things move so fast in the online gambling industry in terms of adopting new technology, but also adapting technologies from other industries. And this is even more pronounced with operators who aren't kind of slowed down, as it were, by any sort of regulatory oversight. Yeah, things like cryptocurrencies, as you can see on the slide, accepted by about 1/4 of websites and by about 2/3 of unlicensed websites. That was hardly on the radar 5 years ago, but they're becoming more and more popular. And also the use of third-party software and technologies such as mirror websites, which we'll explain in a minute, both mean that it's both easier than ever to set up an illegal betting operation and to avoid detection than it ever has been. So technology, new payments, really facilitating this growth in illegal betting. Briefly, how we set about the data analysis. So we started with about 20,000 websites, which are categorized as gambling by a tool called SimilarWeb, which is a leading web analytics software used by Google, Walmart, Adidas, many Fortune 500 companies. We filtered those out for websites with average monthly visits of more than 1 million people. And then we added back a random selection of about 100 sites. So we weren't just looking at the biggest websites. And then a further selection of sites which we had encountered in previous research, which we suspected would be unlicensed. After we removed false positives, we had about 534 websites in total. I think it was from 61 global jurisdictions. So it is a broad-based sample size of the market. We looked at each of the 500 plus websites, both manually and using software APIs, or recorded licensing information, web traffic data going back 2 years, information about the servers these websites were hosted on, customer demographics, what products they offered, payment providers they accepted, and more. And so at the end of that, kind of at the bottom of the slide, we had a big database, and from that, we called the key data points, trends, and new developments that I'll talk a little bit about. Yeah, so Martin mentioned, the sort of gray areas around the legal betting, and a question we get asked at like every single presentation we do is, all right, what is the definition of illegal betting? Simply put, because online betting is a transnational global industry, some countries and jurisdictions have no gambling laws. Some have laws that were written in the early 20th, even the 19th centuries, when online betting wasn't exactly a big issue. Simply put, there's no one unified or universally agreed definition. So what we did for this report is focus on one quite simple question: is the betting operator licensed at the point of sale? And what that means is the betting operator licensed in the same jurisdiction in which it's taking bets from customers? So that gave us 3 categories, as you can see on the screen: licensed and regulated. These are operators which are, for example, if you're taking bets from UK customers, you're licensed by the UK Gambling Commission. If you're taking bets from US or Australian customers, you're licensed by one of the state regulators in those territories, and so on. Unlicensed and unregulated is kind of equally easy to comprehend. These are operators with no license at all. We see there's a lot, particularly in Asia, where online betting is typically unlawful, illegal, or heavily restricted, and they're typically directly run by organized crime. In the middle is kind of what has been called gray market betting, or gray areas. We call them licensed but under-regulated. They do have licenses from certain jurisdictions, which typically specialize in issuing online betting licenses, but crucially, they take bets from all over the world, regardless of whether they're licensed in the jurisdictions they're taking bets, and regardless often or typically of the prevailing legality or lawfulness of betting in those jurisdictions. The key point here for people to take away is that both licensed but under-regulated and unlicensed and unregulated are in effect illegal betting in most jurisdictions. So in terms of those categories, fully 61% of the 534 sites we examined were in one of those 2 latter categories. So almost 2/3 of the market, in effect, illegal betting. And of the hundreds of websites which were licensed but under-regulated, just 3 jurisdictions issued almost 2/3 of those licenses. You can see on the map, in Curacao, private companies issue licenses with what seems to be close to 0 regulatory oversight. Now, although in recent weeks, the Netherlands, of which Curacao is a constituent country, has been increasing the pressures on Curacao to tighten up that oversight. For many years, the only paperwork or credentials you needed for a license there is a check for about 35 to 50,000 euros. In the Philippines, the entire purpose of the so-called Philippines Offshore Gaming Operators License, or POGO, is basically to lend a veneer of respectability to operators who target bettors across Asia, where, as we said, online gambling is typically illegal. As the recent arrest in Macau of one key figure behind a certain POGO licensee for alleged illegal gambling, money laundering, and links to Chinese triad societies shows these operators are often linked to organized crime and other criminality. And finally, on the map, Malta in the European Union, which relies on issuing gambling licenses for about 12% of GDP. You know, it might argue, and may be correct, that it has much better standards of oversight than those other two jurisdictions, but it too has had its issues, with Italian organized crime groups laundering vast sums through Maltese licensed operators, just for one example. And then when we looked at traffic going back over 24 months, so kind of crossing over the pre-COVID and post-COVID period. And in summary, all the websites we looked at saw significant growth in this period. You know, that's been accelerated by the impacts of COVID. You've had, you know, people locked down at home, looking for entertainment, perhaps having a bit of extra money from stimulus checks and so on, or not spending money on normal forms of entertainment that they would. But this growth rate, as you can see, was almost double, 64% to 36% in the unregulated market. And reasons for this include basically the unregulated market can make a very attractive product because it's not limited by any regulation. So it aggressively markets through social media spam, often targeting specifically problem gamblers. They can offer better prices, i.e. betting odds, because they don't pay tax, or they pay a minimal amount in these gambling tax havens. And they can offer many more products, i.e. many more sports, and within those sports, many, many more different bet types, you know, even going down to like almost amateur level and youth level football, for example. And again, because they're not bound by any regulation. You know, and a key factor we think for regulators and stakeholders to understand is, you know, well-regulated licensed operators need a bit of flexibility to compete on a more level playing field against such operators. And over-regulating the licensed and regulated segment will just drive customers to the illegal market. In terms of products that we looked at, we're obviously interested in horse racing, being a racing federation. Horse racing does remain a major betting product on more than a third of websites. And the vast majority of those offered racing from Asian Racing Federation jurisdictions. So in other words, illegal betting does continue to be a major threat to the integrity of racing in ARF jurisdictions and elsewhere. Relatively new products such as esports, which had a big rise during COVID because it was, you know, still going while more traditional sports were shut down. It's now available on 2/3 of websites, a potential concern given its natural appeal to young people and its lack of well-developed integrity controls compared to some more mature sports. And interestingly, these were so-called sports betting websites that we looked at, but the vast majority, 81%, don't just offer sports betting, they offer a wide range of gambling products. You know, not just sports betting, which does have some degree of skill, but purely random number generated gambling games, digital slots, virtual products, casino games, both virtual and live dealer, all of which can lead to high frequency gambling and thus potential harm at a much higher rate. Credit betting remains ubiquitous, which again is another factor of potential harm to the consumer. And a key development, as we mentioned, is the growth of cryptocurrencies. And as we mentioned, it's particularly pronounced in the illegal markets. And, you know, you can kind of intuit some of the reasons why that would be. You know, it's appealing not just for bettors in jurisdictions where betting may be illegal or unlawful, because it's easy for them to fund accounts and difficult for authorities to trace. But it's especially attractive for illegal bookmakers because it allows them easily to offshore their profits, pay their staff anonymously, move funds, mix funds with perhaps the proceeds of crime from elsewhere, and generally hide the true nature of their business activities. We mentioned mirror websites as a technology which facilitates the rise of illegal betting, particularly by making it hard to detect. We found that the vast majority, 81% of unlicensed betting websites, they don't just exist on one single URL. It's not just xyzbet.com. They'll have networks of tens, if not hundreds, of mirror websites, which are essentially carbon copies of the website under different URLs. The little dot chart on the right of this slide shows one example of a typical network of about 69 sites, with the orange dot in the middle, the main URL, and then the blue dots mirror websites. One interesting thing to note is that because of these networks, it can be difficult to get a true indication of the real scale of illegal betting. Like, for example, if you look at the web traffic to one very well-known betting operator, which is licensed in the Philippines, its annual traffic to the main URL was about 28 million visits a year. But when we look into its server and we identify more than 450 mirror websites, and you total the traffic of the entire network, it was about 12 times greater, more than 330 million visits. And the vast majority of that was from Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, and the US, interestingly. None of these jurisdictions in which this particular operator is licensed, and most of those jurisdictions, online betting illegal. So again, that just underlines our key contention that licensed but under-regulated operators out of the Philippines, Curacao, and elsewhere are facilitating illegal betting on a huge scale. It's also interesting that even some licensed and regulated operators also use mirror websites, which raises the question of why would apparently law-abiding companies need networks of websites seemingly designed to evade the attention of authorities. Another technological factor we mentioned, and I think Tom will talk a bit more about white labeling and the supply chain of online betting. But as mentioned up at the start, it's easier than ever to set up an online betting website. Okay, you can get everything off the shelf. About 3/4 of the websites we examined used one such software provider, if not several. So all your odds, your trading, your risk management, your customer relationship management, these can all be handled off the shelf. You need basically zero technical expertise, sports expertise, betting odds and risk management expertise to become an illegal bookmaker. And a subset of this is the supply of sports data to legal and illegal betting operators alike. Data feeds are essential to provide odds. They're the lifeblood of the sports betting industry. Without it, you can't offer markets, and particularly not in-play markets, which are the most lucrative form of betting. So the supply of such data by the providers to regulated, under-regulated, and unregulated operators alike is fueling the growth in the latter two categories, i.e. illegal betting. Really the key takeaway is racing and other sports need to be aware, not just of the value of the data, but where it's ending up further down the supply chain. If you might sign an agreement with one provider, but where is the data going after that? So I'll wrap up there. That was a brief overview of section 1 of the report. There are 7 sections in the report which build on these findings. But in conclusion from me, Martin, online betting is it's increasingly blurry, both for regulators, but also crucially for consumers who typically don't understand, is this website I'm on legal, illegal, or just don't care. The demand for online betting is outpacing the ability of sports and other stakeholders to understand the issues. Technology has made it easier than ever to become an online bookmaker and to get involved in online betting. And, while responsible, well-behaved corporate citizens in the licensed and regulated segment can bring huge benefits to society, huge tax payments, support payments to support thousands of people, employment, responsible safeguardings in place, etc. There's none of that in the illegal markets. They have no such benefits, and indeed quite the opposite. They're fueling problem gambling, they're funding organized crime and related criminality, and they're corrupting the integrity of racing and other sports. So we don't think this is a victimless crime for these reasons, and hopefully this brief overview can support our contention there, and hopefully the report can explain these issues to the key stakeholders, again, many of whom are on the call. So please do, share the report widely, and thanks again for your attendance. Yeah, that's all from me, Martin. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
James, thank you very much. I should just point out to everyone that the full report is over 100 pages, and James's part is obviously a very substantial piece of that. In fact, James's work, as we're both on the sort of secretariat of this council, took over a year. So it's a substantial amount of work. So please do go and have a look at the report if you have time. And James, we'll come back to a couple of the issues you've raised in due course with some questions about some specifics. But could we cut across to Tom? So Tom Chignall, you're in Hong Kong. Obviously, you've been involved in bet monitoring, betting analysis for integrity purposes in both Hong Kong and the UK. You've been doing this for a long time, not too long. I'm not suggesting your age here, Tom, but perhaps you can talk to us about the data issue, especially in betting. So in horse racing and other sports, betting data, as James just started to explain, is used in both illegal and legal markets. So you've talked in your report in the State of Illegal Betting about the nature of white label betting websites and also about the sale of data. Perhaps you could just expand on those areas and tell us about the report. Thanks.
Martin, thanks for the invite as well to participate in today's webinar. I think going on that and actually following on from what James has said, white labeling, B2Bs, the sale of data, there is a big overlap and crossover amongst those three. I prepared a few slides which are mainly orientated around the white labeling, but they do really explain where sports betting data fits within the you could say the issues and challenges that sports and betting regulators face with the illegal market. So just bear with me. Okay, so with white labeling, as James has touched upon, the supply of sports betting data and the related white labeling sales of betting websites is really blurring the line between legal and illegal betting. And as James said, it's never been easier to actually set up a betting website. What do we mean by that? It's no exaggeration to say that you can set up a website within about a month without having any expertise about odds and betting or the technical expertise if you're prepared to take on a complete white label. And these white labels, as well as the situation with the B2Bs or some service providers, have supported the growth of the illegal betting market and are an integrity threat to racing and sports. And I think that's probably going to be hopefully the key takeaway from the next few slides. So what is white labeling? I mean, to try and keep it exceptionally simple, a complete white labeling would be the betting equivalent of a major car manufacturer building a vehicle, but allowing another company to slap its logo and brand on it for sale. As James said, the supplier provides all the technology, the websites, the markets, the live streaming, etc. And the operator's role can just be limited to branding and marketing and recruiting new bettors. And if they're taking that approach, they're going to pay high service fees, meaning that a constant stream of new losing bettors must be found. Now that really explains why they're so aggressive and active on social media. And in Hong Kong, for example, we're inundated with WhatsApp adverts of white label and illegal betting websites. And if you're on Facebook and you follow a Premier League team, there's no doubt you've seen offers or continuous offers for live streaming, which is so often linked to illegal betting operators and white labeling. The final point on there is really kind of brings it all back. How does this impact on racing and sports integrity? Well, a good example is the white label betting exchanges who channel bets from customers in a lightly or unregulated markets into the wider regulated exchange, and this is a key integrity risk. So what we have here is a white label betting exchange channeling bets into a well-regulated betting exchange, and this has come up in horse racing investigations in recent times. I think a great example, or very much one in the public domain, was the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board, whose referrals committee, in their published reasons for a case, implied that this setup can hinder the identification of those behind suspicious betting. So it does really cause a practical problems for sports investigations, horse racing investigations. Okay, so as James touched upon, I don't want to really go over this too much, but betting websites need these functions to actually operate. They require the live sports data feeds, live video streaming, customer relationship management, etc., etc. And this software is typically licensed. As James pointed out, 73% of betting websites actually use this. Even the largest betting organizations in the world are taking B2B software to some extent because there's no real reason or desire to actually try and create everything in-house. But the key problem is when these betting suppliers are servicing the unregulated operators and supporting the unregulated and illegal market. And the unlicensed and unregulated operators almost exclusively rely on third-party suppliers and data suppliers. Here's where it gets quite interesting. Some of you will be very aware of in terms of the licensing about white labeling. But what we have is that white label betting operators enter a partnership with a white label provider and then operate under the provider's license. So they don't actually need a unique license themselves. They form partnerships with white label providers and then operate under their license. So this can allow betting operators to avoid real regulation. The white labeling arrangement provides some legitimacy to operators, typically in Asia, by allowing them to present themselves as licensed, well-respected, and market themselves as very credible to the Asian public, where so often betting is illegal. The key thing also under this setup, they're allowed to promote themselves with major European sports teams and leagues. And we'd be very familiar with the setup with football and the marketing and the sponsorship there. It's a very effective way to really advertise their brand in countries where they simply cannot advertise because betting is illegal or their products are not allowed. So white label licenses, this setup of operating under a white label provider's license helps facilitate white label operators to advertise at European football matches in Chinese, in Thai, Indonesian, Vietnamese, and other Asian languages. As I said, the product is typically illegal in such jurisdictions, and the adverts often direct themselves to unregulated adverts often direct the users to unregulated Asian-facing mirror websites, which, as James has pointed out, are basically clones of the original website to avoid the geo-blocking of authorities who are trying to prevent them acting illegally. And the white label licensed websites themselves are sometimes not even online, because the purpose of these white label arrangements is not to attract European customers, but solely to advertise betting in Asia. Just to really expand on that, some sports regulators will actually list the B2B partners or white label partners, and you'll often see so-and-so bookmaker.co.uk as registered on the regulator's website. But these betting operators will not advertise .co.uk. They're always going to be .io or something in Chinese. They're not interested really in the UK European markets. They just want to get themselves out to Asia. Okay, and just really just go back. Sorry, just jump back to that. Why are they doing that? Is because I think the United Nations last year or this year actually said that the size of the illegal betting market is on an annual basis is 1.5 trillion US dollars. So to actually get a small piece of the pie, that's why they're so keen to do that. And that's why you'll see the adverts at such top European sports teams, whether it's Premier League teams or the major teams who are participating in the Champions League. They can afford it because of the sheer size and scale of the illegal market. Okay, I just really wanted to give an example, and I'm using the UK. The UK GC is exceptionally transparent and clear about how they operate and their findings, and they're by no means unique in terms of this model, but it just allows us to really get an understanding as to how white labels are operating. So back in 2020, the UK Gambling Commission said there is a concern that unlicensed operators who would potentially not pass the Gambling Commission's initial licensing suitability checks are looking to use the white label model to provide gambling services in Great Britain. They identified more than 700 white label partners and stated that this model was increasingly popular to bring global exposure to an operator's product. So this highlights two key points. The primary intention of many white labels is not to market or to attract UK bettors, but to piggyback on the credibility of the UK GC license to market globally. And such operators may not even pass the UK Gambling Commission's own suitability criteria. So effectively, the UK Gambling Commission is transferring responsibility for oversight to the white label provider, who is responsible to ensure that appropriate safeguarding measures and controls are in place and to address money laundering and politically exposed persons risks. Quite a bit to take on. And this allows more than 700 white label offshore online betting websites to be operated with varying regulatory oversights. Credit to the GC though, they have fined providers for not carefully managing all third-party websites that they are responsible for. And this includes, just give you an example on that, includes a white label provider who failed to oversee its websites, which were found to have sent thousands of emails to customers who had previously self-excluded from online betting, to have lacked AML controls, and to have used inappropriate advertising containing nudity. That white label provider was fined £600,000. And the UK GC takes action against such issues and makes transparent such judgments. However, less stringent regulators are without a doubt going to be far less concerned with the negative consequences, let alone conduct any real enforcement. But I don't want to get away from the real situation here is that white label providers help facilitate the expansion of the unregulated online betting operators to a global audience. They're helping to grow this large growing illegal market. So I want to touch upon why this is why this links back to racing integrity. Why is it important for sports, and how it impacts the integrity of events. So Asian-facing white label operators rely heavily on agents to recruit customers, facilitate account access, and settle payments. What this effectively means, if I'm a customer and I want to bet with a white label, I cannot bet directly with that white label. I have to go through a betting agent. So there is a gap between myself and the agent. And betting agents' websites provide access to a wide range of betting operators. Interestingly enough, if you look at them, you will find that these are mainly unregulated and illegal. However, within them, you will see some pretty established, well-regulated names as well, which unfortunately is giving credibility to the illegal bookmakers who are sat next to them. As I said, a lot of these operators are simply illegal and not available in the customer's jurisdictions. So white label operators and betting agents significantly complicate audit trails for race and match fixing investigations. There's a real lack of transparency on who the customers are, their accounts, and individual transactions. The reporting of suspicious betting to sports and betting regulators simply doesn't happen. And in doing so, it undermines a well-regulated betting market. So in a well-regulated betting market, you'd have a sports integrity team in direct communication with the betting operator, that sports integrity unit is able to make checks on suspicious betting, have regular healthy communication, and share customer details and transaction level details. That simply cannot happen, and that's why it really is a major issue in hindering and making sports integrity investigations far more complex. Okay, so just this is my final slide, and I just really want to summarize firstly on the actual white label model itself. That model, what I described, allows operators of questionable origins to set up licensed betting websites, which appear to the bettor to be licensed and regulated, even though such operators have been subject to none of the oversight of their white label providers. Now, point 2 here, bullet point 2, each point there could be its own, is worthy of its own presentation. There's no clear ownership of these white label operators. There's insufficient problem gambling controls, insufficient consumer protection, and the same with the anti-money laundering controls. All major points. But my focus is on betting integrity, and they do cause major issues, as previously pointed out, with the not reporting on suspicious betting activity or breaches of the rules of racing or sports rules, not sharing information on customers suspected of being involved in corruption, failing to establish sufficient know your customer processes, and allowing gamblers to bet with anonymity and via cryptocurrency. And I know James touched upon cryptocurrency. It's a fashionable thing at the moment, but it shouldn't be underestimated. We've had multiple credible pieces of intelligence suggesting that major legal bookmakers are demanding payment in cryptocurrency, and cryptocurrency payments and deposits is becoming more and more common in sports investigations. And finally, due to the use of betting agents, the actual white label betting operators themselves do not even know who their customers are. That's it with my slides and my brief presentation. I'll hand you back to Martin. I'd be more than willing to take some questions later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Really, there's a lot in there. And I think for our audience, which for this webinar, we did have a first webinar that was more Asian focused, Asian Australia focused last week, but this webinar is in time zone for Europe and Americas. I think we have a very Asian perspective here, and as Tom said, the white labeling licensing system is clearly facilitating the expansion of illegal, what are in Asia illegal betting operators, and I think that's what's not visible in Europe. But what is visible is that illegal market is the major threat to sports integrity and the driver of corruption in sports, corruption in racing to some extent as well. So it's not the legal markets where the risk is, it's those illegal markets, and a lot of those illegal operators come through the white labeling system. So that's why it's relevant. But thank you very much, Tom. We'll cut across quickly to Brant, because I think it's a good introduction from Tom as to how you then deal with this illegal market situation and the legal market situation. And Brant's group, the British Horse Racing Authority, has done that for many years. I remember visiting one of your predecessors, Brant, 15 years ago to see your bet monitoring, bet analysis team. So BHA has been doing this successfully for a long time. So Brant, you've put a lot of resources into this, the bet monitoring function. You've done it for well over a decade. It's a pretty developed function. Could you just explain to us the importance of that for racing, and also how illegal betting markets may make that bet monitoring more complex?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for the opportunity to speak on the webinar. Yeah, obviously, both James and Tom have just now gone through and explained much of why this is a challenge for us from a technical perspective. And the State of Illegal Betting report, I think, further illustrates how important the issue of monitoring and understanding betting markets is for integrity in horse racing to us, but also its relevance for other sports. Those that work in horse racing will know this, but certainly for the benefit of other sports, horse racing has, from its very beginning, had a unique and interdependent relationship with betting. Its history extends back over 500 years or so, probably further. And racing has long generated, revenue, which was, talked about by Tom, which supports the industry, provides taxes to the public purse, which in turn, through either direct or indirect contributions, actually assists funding other sectors in society. Therefore, the need to properly regulate activities around betting on racing has a long history, is well established in practice, and includes centuries, in fact, of case law. And this has enabled those responsible for this important task to develop and evolve processes and systems simultaneously with the development of the wagering market. So Tom was involved in this going back some 10, 15 years ago. The BHA, along with numerous other racing and regulatory bodies, such as the Hong Kong Jockey Club, Racing Victoria, for example, have developed internal systems and teams to monitor betting on their own racing. And in our example, we also support some of our colleague jurisdictions in that regard. And that investment makes racing very different in some respects to other sports, who tend to rely on these third-party organisations at times to perform this function for them. And this is understandable in some respects, because with the evolution of many sports from largely recreational pastimes to sports wagering products has only really developed more rapidly in recent decades for many of those sports. In racing, however, we do have a long history of controlling, managing our data, wagering and media rights, and this enables our sport to have greater control over where and who offers propositions on our products. But as we've heard, these changes to the markets over recent years has made that far more challenging and complex. We invest in developing relationships with those operators who are regulated and are legitimately offering and entitled to offer products for wagering purposes on our sport. We share information and intelligence with those operators to monitor and mitigate risk of wrongdoing. And if such wrongdoing is detected, as has been well described in various of our previous publications, we'll prosecute under the rules of racing, or alternatively refer to law enforcement or other relevant agencies for investigation. However, where our product is offered by those operating within what the State of Legal Betting Report defines as unlicensed or under or unregulated and such like environments, we then have limited scope as a racing authority to act on any wrongdoing. So, that's obviously adds to the complexity, and Tom talked about it in his presentation. An example of this, which Tom actually already went through, was the recent case that appears in the most recent State of Illegal Betting Report and was well summarised by Professor Jack Anderson, one of our council members, and that's the case of Viking Ford in Ireland recently. And in the reasons for the decision, it was noted in evidence that during the hearing in relation to the matter, there were lay bets initially placed with an exchange via a limited liability company emanating from this so-called white label website that Tom's just described, an example of this. So with some suggestion during the proceedings of that hearing that such a mechanism was used to hinder the identification possible beneficiaries of this lay betting. So that's a very tangible example of where the work that our bet monitoring team can be very much hindered and has become far more complex with the evolution of this unregulated, underregulated, illegal betting market or environment. So in conclusion, Martin, from our perspective, our systems, we believe in racing, therefore must continue to evolve to adapt to the changes of the market. And racing in sports, I think, can play a very important role in helping to share a broader understanding of how the market has changed. Webinars such as this and the information in the various publications that the council have produced helps others who are unfamiliar with these challenges understand that. And in a conversation recently with an individual working in an integrity organisation in another sport, suddenly I can see that in some of those sports that are only just developing their systems, these threats are becoming far better understood and well known.
Brant, thank you very much. We should thank Brant especially because he's taken time away from Goodwood to do this webinar. I think Goodwood describes itself as the most beautiful racecourse in the world, Brant, so I hope you can get back there after this. And I think for our audience, it's particularly relevant because said Brant and his team have done this for many years. So they conduct their own analysis on betting, obviously deal with betting companies directly. You can still deal with data companies, they still have their role, but I think racing is a very good example from the BHA, from Hong Kong, from several operators in Australia, such as Racing Victoria, of where bet monitoring, bet analysis can be conducted by the authority itself. And I think that's critical for other sports to learn from, because you do have to understand betting markets on your sport. And racing does that very well, I think, led by people like Brant and Tom. James Porteous, perhaps we could come back to you if we can. We have a question from Patrick Cummings in the US. Welcome, Patrick. And I'll just put this to you, James, if I could. Do you believe the growth of cryptocurrency use is helping to fuel the illegal market growth as the massive hurdle of funding illegal betting accounts and getting paid by operators is easier and quicker than ever? James, you've written about cryptocurrency use in betting markets. Do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, 100%. It's not whether I believe it, it is fact. We saw, or I mentioned, I think, 5 years ago, we didn't really have that perhaps on our radar, but the illegal operators didn't just have it on their radar, they were using it actively even 5 years ago. I saw an interview with a well-known bookmaker turned investor in gambling companies just this week. And he said, I toured Asia 5 years ago to look at some of these operators. And what amazed me was that they were all or the vast majority were using cryptocurrency in their operations. And, you know, part of the reason for that, as Pat says, particularly in Asia, where the markets are so huge and people are betting such large amounts of money, which I think would maybe stagger some of the colleagues from Europe, the amount of money guys will bet on a single football match and throughout a football match if they're betting in play. You just can't move that amount of money through normal channels without getting flagged up by your bank's money laundering controls or the government regulations. So yes, it has been going on for several years, particularly in Asia, and now even more widespread. You know, our analysis said, well, our analysis shows about 2/3 or almost 2/3 of unlicensed websites offer cryptocurrency, and about 1/4 of all the websites we looked at were using cryptocurrency, and you know, particularly these less reputable operators who may have a license in, e.g., Curacao, Philippines, and elsewhere. And you know, you have to wonder why. What is the incentive for such operators who nobody knows the ultimate beneficial owners of? Nobody knows who's behind them. Why would you want to transact such large volumes in a currency that cannot be traced, or it is very difficult to trace? I shouldn't say it cannot be traced. You know, and my contention or strong belief would be that because they're using it for improper means or illegal means. So in answer to Pat's question, yes, that's a long-winded way of saying yes, definitely.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that very briefly, and I think before betting became legal in the United States, it used to take people sometimes 2-3 weeks to actually settle up with their illegal bookmaker. But with cryptocurrency, it was done within minutes or seconds. I think that if you take that and then add it to Asia, it provides a motivation to use the currency.
We're coming up to the end of the hour, and probably many people on the call have other meetings to get to or get away to something. So we won't overrun, but perhaps we could just wind up by asking first Brant and then Tom and James, what do you see as the near-term main threats from illegal betting markets to your own area? So racing in UK and Europe, for example, Brant.
For us, Martin, I think you covered it earlier in that we don't fully understand in Europe the extent of what's happening in the market, and that's a challenge for us. I mean, this work across Asia is indicative of what is obviously happening in other parts of the world. For us in Europe, we have begun some work on seeking some funding to do some additional work to better understand the nature of the unregulated illegal market in Europe and its impacts on racing and sports in particular. So that's a collaborative effort. But for us, in terms of the direct challenge, it's the traditional bet monitoring systems and functions are built for an age that has now, to a certain extent, passed us by, and we need to develop those systems to better deal with these threats and challenges. The other important key, I think, for us is continuing to maintain ownership of that investment internally, because you know, if you as a sport, whether you're racing or you're another sport, if you maintain that control of how the monitoring function operates, it means that you're not fettering off your responsibility as a proper regulator.
Thank you very much, Brant. Tom, what worries you most in the near term? You've got a short break for the summer at the moment, which I'm sure you'll be relieved, but you're back in September to racing. What worries you most about the threat from illegal markets?
Yeah, I'd say I've been at the Jockey Club for about 7 years now, and even in that time, I've seen an explosion in the amount of operators, unregulated, lightly regulated operators who are betting on Hong Kong racing. It really has taken off, and it's a case of really just trying to keep up with that. for the bet monitoring purposes. But it's almost it's very, very difficult to actually say that you're going to track everything because of the sheer size of the illegal market on one betting exchange is actually as big, if not bigger, than the Hong Kong Jockey Club's turnover, which turns over $1 billion plus every race meeting. So to say that you're going to capture everything isn't really realistic. And it's very important for us to build that intelligence network, to work with other operators, work with other stakeholders, and really try and keep ahead of the game and help each other.
Tom, build back better, as some of our political leaders have said in racing. Yes. James, lastly, what worries you about this continued growth in illegal markets?
Yeah, look, I mean, Martin, you mentioned at the start I was a sports journalist in a previous life and a big sports fan. And, you know, as we've touched on, I think we've mentioned, you know, this is the #1 threat to the integrity of sports, not just racing, but football, badminton, tennis, table tennis, if you're a lover of sport, you should be concerned about this issue, because if your sport starts being corrupted and gets a perception of being corrupt and not fair, people will lose interest in it. People won't want to take part. Attendances will go down, revenues will go down. It'll be more vulnerable to corruption. That the vicious cycle will, you know, go on. You know, there's been many well-documented instances of this across the history of sport globally. So, yeah, you know, before I took this job, this was something I was maybe vaguely aware of. You know, I like to having a bet every now and then, as we all probably do socially, but the sheer scale and the nature of these markets is very hard, I think, for people who aren't immersed in it like we are to understand. But you do need to understand it, I think, if you're involved in sport or even, you know, tangentially related to it, as some of the stakeholders and attendees on the call may be.
Yeah, James, thank you very much. Good summing up. Tom and Brant, really thank you for making the time late at night, I know, for James and Tom in Hong Kong, and Brant in the middle of a very busy week for you. So really grateful for giving the time for this. Thank you very much for the around 50 people who joined as attendees. I do hope you have something from this. Please go to the Asian Racing Federation website, and the full report and also our other reports are there for download. Contact us if you have any questions. There are contact details on the website. So thank you very much for taking the time to join this, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you for now. Bye, everyone.